what do we make of this new Citroen DS3R then? On the one hand, we have to applaud Citroen for coming back and making another proper hot hatchback. This one has over 200 horsepower. But on the other hand, there's also something slightly sinister about the pricing of this car. At £24,000, it feels to me as if Citroen's saying, if you want us to make small, fast cars, we're going to have to make them in smaller volumes and we're going to have to charge you a lot more money for them. But, as they say, the proof is in the driving. First impressions of the DS3R then? Well, I have to applaud them for going to town on the kind of accoutrements and the finish. Nice big bolstered seats, lots of carbon, feels special, feels quite expensive. Doesn't feel 24 grand though, that's a key point. 200 brake horsepower and 203 foot-pounds of torque give the DS3R some numbers bragging rights, just behind the Mini. And its 7.3 second 0 to 60 time is identical to the Mini's too. 100 takes 17.5 seconds. But dynamically I've already got a few reservations. You see, this feels to me like a very fast version of an ordinary car, not a hot hatchback. And the key distinction there is that the control weights just aren't there. You know, it feels quite normal. Steering's not too bad. In fact, it gives me a good idea of what's going on, but gear shift is quite long-winded, pedals aren't especially nice, gear ratios are quite wide. You know what I'm getting at here? This is not an exciting car. But it does share an engine and a gearbox with a Mini Cooper S, and I suppose we ought to drive that next. This is the same 1.6 litre turbo motor you get in the DS3R, this time with 208 horsepower and 207 foot-pounds of torque. It does the business. 60 in 7.1, 100 in 17.2, the fastest car here. And sitting in the Mini, it's not entirely good news for the Citroen, I have to say. Somehow, the same engine and gearbox feels much punchier and more effervescent in this car. I've got exhaust noise, I've got a nicer gear shift, I've actually got shorter gear ratios, so I'm pulling about 60 miles an hour in second gear in this, but the Citroen will pull nearly 70 miles an hour in second gear. As for the dynamics of the car, the Mini's firmer. I hadn't expected that. It feels a lot firmer, connects you to the road more. With the sport button on in the Mini, the steering's not that nice. With the sport button off, it's much more pleasant. Interesting car, this Mini, because it's a style statement, isn't it? The interior makes no sense whatsoever, and you could argue that this car is about style over substance. But there is one car here that's about substance and not much more. The 2 litre Clio's extra capacity doesn't quite fill the hole of a turbocharger. 198 brake horsepower but only 159 foot-pounds of torque means it struggles against the Mini. 60 in a decent 7.3 seconds but only 18.2 to 100. You see, dropping the Clio Renault Sport into this test is a bit like dropping a GT3 RS into a fat coupe test. It's just not fair. This is a proper driving machine. One of the best cars you can buy to drive regardless of price. It's just so immediate, and you know it from the moment you get into the seat and it clinches you around the kidneys and you feel that short throw gear shift and the immediate steering, which is, I will say, lacking a bit of feel. This is a proper driving device. I love the way it wants to rev, only 200 horsepower, not as much torque as the others, but it's just so immediate. A great thing. It's lacking some of the interior pizzazz, I'll give you that. It isn't as much of a quality item, but oh wow. To drive, to enjoy, one of the great road cars. The little Corsa uses a 189 horsepower 1.6 litre turbocharged motor with 170 foot-pounds of torque and a 6-speed manual gearbox. It gives 60 in 7.5 seconds and 100 in a slightly disappointing 19.5 seconds. Okay, I won't beat about the bush. I'm not a massive Corsa VXR fan. When you first get in it, it feels about as firm as the Clio, but it gets deflected a lot more. So, in other words, the damping isn't as good. The powertrain isn't great. It's a bit laggy. Everything feels a little bit loose. Just doesn't feel like a specialist device in the way that the Clio does, nor does it have the panache and the finish of the Mini, and nor does it sort of go down a road in as sophisticated a manner as the DS3R. It's slightly out there in its own little, should I say, Burberry-capped place. VW's turbocharged and supercharged 1390cc 4 gives 178 horsepower and a lumpy 184 foot-pounds of torque. Quickest to 60 miles an hour in 7.1 seconds, but only manages 18.9 seconds to 100. To make the Polo GTI, Volkswagen has quite clearly taken the Golf GTI and just thrown it in the tumble dryer for too long. It wanted to shrink the car but retain those sort of core attributes of the Golf, that it's dependable, usable, nicely built, not that exciting. That's the key thing here. The Polo isn't that exciting. Is that a problem? When you're up against a Clio RS, it certainly is a problem. And the DSG gearbox, though very smooth, is kind of even more of a problem because it takes you away from the action more. But it does go down the road in quite a sophisticated manner. It's nicely damped, steers well, the driving position's excellent, the seat's supportive. It's just a bit, well, dull. How does the DS3R compare now I've had a better chance to drive the others? It's an interesting car. It's a car of more depth than I gave it credit for a bit earlier. I think a lot of the carbon work on the car, the aesthetics have been done really, really nicely. And I do think the chassis is quite clever because it never feels like it's that quick, this car. And it never feels like it's covering ground that quickly, but it just deals with stuff. In that respect, it's much better damped, actually, than the Mini, because it just deals with stuff, yeah, in a mature fashion. But yes, that excitement, sadly, is slightly missing in this car. It just isn't up and at me, in my face, like the Clio, and it doesn't quite have the pizzazz, the style of the Mini. It's got the Polo and the Vauxhall well covered off, but the other two, that's interesting. Of course, we're so glad to see Citroen back in this part of the marketplace. But in its absence, it has to be said that Mini, and in particular Renault, have really moved the game on. And so working from the bottom to the top, it leaves us with the following order. For me, in 5th place, the rather uncouth Corsa. In 4th, the slightly boring Polo. In 3rd, I'm afraid to say Citroen the DS3R, because it just hasn't got quite what the Mini has, which is pizzazz and sheer star quality. But for Evo, in 1st place, and for me, I have to say, the Renaultsport Clio is just the most fantastic little hatchback. It's a great driver's car at any price, but for the money, an absolute bargain.